So good evening and welcome to the annual Zerner Lecture, which is now in its fourth year. I'm David Roxburgh, Professor of Islamic Art at Harvard University and also the Chair of the Department of History of Art and Architecture. The Henry Zerner Lecture Fund was established on the occasion of Henry's retirement by his friends, colleagues, former students and other admirers to celebrate his more than 40 years of scholarship and teaching at Harvard. And it's good to see so many of Henry's friends and colleagues here tonight and to be able to express our continued respect and deep affection for him. It's an honor to welcome Professor Stephen Bann, this evening's speaker. A Mancunian by birth, though he carries as much a trace of that as I do my Scottish ancestry, though I'm sure some of you will disagree. A Mancunian by birth, Bann went on to study at Winchester College and King's College, Cambridge, receiving the PhD in 1967, and then held professorships at the University of Kent and the University of Bristol. He was elected to the Fellowship of the British Academy in 1998 and was honoured with a CBE, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, in 2004. His body of scholarship is uncommonly wide-ranging in its scope and implications, working across the fields of art history, visual studies, and cultural history, with critical interventions in the subjects of gardens, 19th century French painting, print culture and photography, the aerial view, history and representations of the past, and in modernism. Bann is also no stranger to Henry. Such friendships and working relationships extend to other members of our audience tonight, which make Professor Bann's presence, I think, all the more meaningful. Before I pass the baton to Professor Eva Laher-Burkhardt, the William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts, who will more fully introduce Professor Bann, I wanted to conclude by thanking members of the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the Harvard Art Museums who have made preparations for this evening's lecture. So Professor Robin Kelsey, Dean of Arts and Humanities, Anne Yannick, the Department Administrator in History of Art and Architecture, Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums, as well as Jessica Martinez, Head, and Molly Ryan, Programs Manager of the Division of Academic and Public Programs. This year's lecture is sponsored by Harvard's Department of History of Art and Architecture through the generosity of alumni and friends in establishing the Henry Zerner Lecture Fund. So I now invite Professor Laher-Burkhardt to the podium for her remarks.
Hello and welcome to the annual Henry Zerner Lecture. It is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Bann, Emeritus Professor of History of Art and Senior Research Fellow at the University of Bristol, as our speaker this evening. Stephen Bann shares many interests with Henri, among them a passion for prints, for photography, and for romantic art. And so it is particularly fitting for him to be delivering a Zerner lecture. But there are, of course, other reasons, chief among them the scope and relevance of Stephen Bann's scholarship, ranging from 19th century art and visual culture to contemporary art, and encompassing subjects as diverse as concrete poetry and garden design. Bann's impressive output testifies to an exceptionally agile and curious mind. Bann's first article, published in 1964, was, as I have learned, I didn't know that, on Rauschenberg and representation. He edited one of the first international anthologies of concrete poetry in 1967. He also published a very important anthology of texts for the history of constructivism, which some of us know, for the series of Documents of Modern Art in 1974. Bann is equally comfortable discussing the art of Edouard Manet, as he did in Ways Around Modernism in 2007, and that of a contemporary Greek artist of international reputation, Yannis Kournelis, as he did in a book published in 2003. Among Bann's recent publication, one finds the edited volume titled Interlacing of Words and Things, Bridging the Nature-Culture Opposition in Gardens and Landscape, 2012, and an exhibition catalogue, L'Invention du Passé, or Invention of the Past, of 2014. He's also the author of numerous essays that it would be too long to cite today. At the core of Bann's expansive scholarly oeuvre, there are two major concerns that make his work particularly relevant and appealing to today's readers. One is Bann's deep and persistent interest in the notions of history and historicity. Another is his consistent concern with what is now termed intermediality, a notion that his work helped introduce into the discipline of art history. Bann has examined the interrelations between what may be called fine arts and other forms of visual culture, especially print and photography, not only on the cultural and social levels, but also on the material level of the medium. Much of recent innovative work in art history focuses on this intermedial connection that Bann's scholarship helped to flesh out as a distinct field of inquiry within the discipline. That Bann would be so deeply concerned with the notion of history is not surprising, given that he has trained as a historian at the University of Cambridge. But it is the methodologically innovative ways in which his work deals with the notion that are revelatory. His 1984 book, The Clothing of Clio, a study of representation of history in 19th century Britain and France, epitomizes Bann's novel approach. Embodied in images, objects, and texts, history is considered in it not as an event or a temporal flow, but a form of knowledge and discourse, a Foucauldian episteme. The new insight that such epistemic model of analysis may offer for understanding of a museum, to take one subject relevant for the locus of our lecture today, is illustrated by one particular essay in this book, which is by now classic. I have often assigned it in class, namely The Poetics of the Museum, Lenoir and du Sommerard. In it, Bann discussed the mode of displaying objects in two different stages in the formations of the Musée de Cluny. Its first iteration as the post-revolutionary Museum of Historical Monuments, assembled by Alexandre Lenoir in the former convent of the Petits Augustins in Paris, and its 19th century transformation by Alexandre du Sommerard into Musée de Cluny. Approaching the display as a semiotic structure, a form of poiesis, Bann revealed two distinct epistemological conceptions of the object: its classic understanding as a specimen versus the romantic approach to it as a relic of history. Similarly conceptual approach to history is evident in Bann's magisterial study of Paul Delaroche, published in 1997. For this book did not only rescue the forgotten master of 19th century art, the painter of the execution of Lady Jane Grey that caused a sensation at the Salon of 1834 from near total oblivion, but performed an epistemic gesture of reconstruction of a discursive realm, the realm of visual culture at large, within which Delaroche's production may be seen as meaningful. As such, the book exemplified a particular kind of revisionism understood as not simply a recuperation of a forgotten figure, but a recasting of the methodological framework within which one may discuss art. It is precisely such reconstitution that Bann undertook in his highly influential parallel lines, Printmakers, Painters, and Photographers in 19th Century France, published in 2001. The book maps out French visual culture of 19th century in terms of interconnections between the world of printmakers, photographers, and painters. The line in the title evokes the emphasis of the book on the technical, procedural, as well as aesthetic, cultural, and social nature of these interconnections. Discussing the renaissance of the reproductive engraving in the 1830s in France, Bann addresses the broader historical and conceptual notion of the reproducibility of the image, challenging some of the powerful models for understanding this notion, including that of Walter Benjamin's. Bann's effort to recover the world of prints before photography aimed to shift attention to the forms of practice that Benjamin, for one, who privileged photography, ignored. Some of the concerns of this book were taken up by Bann in Ways Around Modernism, published in 2007, where he proposes to reconceptualize modernism around the questions of reproducibility of the image as a specific phase in, rather than the rupture in the history of art's relation to the development of new visual technologies. In these numerous publications, of which I wanted just to highlight a few, in my view, the most important ones, Stephen Bann may be said to have truly expanded the field of art history in a deep sense of the term, creating a new discursive space, not only by taking up the cause of the lost or forgotten figures or individuals, but also by reconstructing the forgotten interconnections between different mediums and different social and cultural functions of the visual image. Taking up the cause of a lost painting by discussing the drawings, preparatory drawings for it, I'm sure that he will do it as well today. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Bann.
Well, thank you very much for that extraordinarily sympathetic and, I hope, helpful introduction. And I hope I will be able to live up to it. I'm going to be speaking this evening about a work by the French painter Paul Delaroche. Delaroche was born in 1797, and so he reached maturity shortly after the defeat of the Emperor Napoleon at Waterloo and the end of the French Empire. He studied under the Baron Gros, who had inherited the studio of his master David, but Delaroche did not take the usual path for a brilliant painting student, which involved winning the highly competitive Prix de Rome and passing several years in the Eternal City. Instead of forming his taste through studying the antique, Delaroche made what we judge really to be at least 2 visits to London in the 1820s and familiarized himself at first hand, as well as through print sources, with the new kind of history painting practiced by the former students of Sir Joshua Reynolds, which consisted essentially in substituting the subject matter of national history, including Shakespeare's history plays, for themes from the classics and the Bible as prescribed by the French Academy. This formula proved so successful that Delaroche himself was elected to the French Academy in 1832 and achieved considerable popular success through historical subjects such as the death of Lady Jane Grey, see there on the right, from the Salon of 1834. And the cartoon that you see there, which I think is a rather charming one, celebrates his noted and personally acknowledged similarity, let's say, no more, to the Emperor Napoleon, as well as his early preference for gruesome subjects. The little subtitle which you see here talks of Paul Delaroche with his funereal mien, sa mine funèbre, and his interest in corpses and bones, a few of which you can see scattered in front of him. Well, Delaroche's staff waned in France not long after 1834, and he ceased to exhibit at the Salon after 1837. But within a short time, this was compensated by a truly international success throughout Europe and reaching North America. And in fact, I could say that by that stage, he'd become really the most famous artist in the Western world, literally a fame that stretched from New York to St. Petersburg. Mr. Woodbury Langburn had bought a work of his in 1849 and then sent it back across the Atlantic a couple of years later. And the Tsar of Russia was known to have said to his father-in-law, Delaroche's father-in-law, Horace Vernet, I have all of his prints. Well, from that point onwards, 1850, Delaroche's reputation began to tumble, only to be retrieved, in part at any rate, over the past 20 years or so. I can recall having a very brief conversation on the subject with that great American scholar of French painting, Robert Rosenblum. It was actually only a year or two before his death. And he said to me, "We must have a talk sometime about good, bad painting." Well, that's not quite how I would characterize the work of Delaroche. But I do hope to suggest in the lecture that follows some of the reasons for taking him quite seriously, and not just as a showman specializing in gruesome subjects, as the cartoon suggests, but as an artist who worked up his themes not only through continuous self-examination, but also through a continuous dialogue with tradition. Possibly the one thing that people know or think they know about Delaroche today is that he once made a famous comment on seeing the photographic work of Daguerre for the first time. "From today, painting is dead." In fact, that particular comment was never made. I've spent a lot of time endeavoring to prove the point, but that's another story. What is, however, entirely true, incontrovertible, is that Delaroche was the first living artist to have an entire volume of photographs of his life's work published. The work of the English-born photographer Robert Jefferson Bingham, which appeared just 2 years after Delaroche had died in 1856. And also in 1858, there appeared what you see on the right, print after the same picture by Louis-Henri Dupont, the most long-lived and in many ways the most influential reproductive printmaker of the century, who had also produced prints after several of Delaroche's other major works. Well, it's because of the existence of these two key images that we're able, I think, to envisage the end point of the story that I'll be telling here. That is, the work painted for Baron James de Rothschild, delivered in 1853. Rothschild having at that stage, he'd had the largest fortune in France during the reign of King Louis Philippe. And when the king himself had to hurry out of France after the revolution of 1848, presumably this left Rothschild unchallenged in that respect. Unfortunately, we know very little about the circumstances of the painting when it was originally delivered to the Baron de Rothschild, except that we do know that it hung in the lavish townhouse of the Rothschilds in the Rue Lafitte, and that it was spaced specifically in the bedroom of the wife of Baron James. You see here this charming wife. It was actually his niece, Jenny, who he'd married in 1824, and here is the celebrated portrait that Ingres was commissioned to do in 1841. Now, this work had in many ways a more fortunate history than the Delaroche I'm going to be talking about today. It was commandeered by the Germans during the Second World War, but then returned in June 1946 Whether Delaroche's Moses was also lost or confiscated at this particular point is still a matter of speculation. In fact, the Rothschild archives seem to have no trace of the point at which it disappeared and what might have happened to it. What we know simply from its measurements, so at the time when it was exhibited, is that it was closely comparable in size to the portrait by Ingres. And you can see the measurements that I've given there. And no doubt for this reason it was more suited to a bedroom than to a more public situation of a salon. It was of similar proportions, though a little narrower, than another work which Delaroche had painted for another plutocrat, Rothschild's neighbour in the Rue Lafitte, the English Marquess of Hertford, the Virgin and Child of 1844. And I show this work in its actual situation in the Wallace collection in order to give a more concrete idea of its physical presence, but also because I'm going to suggest later on, looking at it more closely, that it has a strategic relationship to the Moses of Delaroche. We get to know quite a lot about the now vanished picture, which you see the photograph by Bingham on the left, from the notes to the compendium of 1858 for which the photographs were provided. First of all, there's the biblical source from the book of Exodus, and I'll use an English translation of the Bible for that, but we will return at a later point to a particular nuance which I think is there in the French, but probably not in the usually taken English translations. Anyhow, the English translation, the woman of the house of Levi conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Well, this is Delaroche's subject, sometimes called the exposition of Moses or the exposing of Moses. And the further details given here in the passage that you will see on the screen, details of its long gestation, appear to be, up to a point, accurate. First, it was sketched in Paris in 1840. After a few years, I think, as I will be explaining, Delaroche goes to Rome, and it's from this point that we can date several of the early sketches. It's taken up again in 1848. We know that because there's a letter in which he informs a friend that he's attempting a study of reeds, a new study of reeds. And then, finally, third moment, he begins again on a completely new canvas, probably in 1852, and it's delivered in 1853. The various oil sketches that are mentioned here, though, cannot easily be traced. In fact, I think you will probably see in one case, yes, 0.77 by length 1/100th or 1/10th of a centimetre. That clearly is not the case. And actually, we can find out without much of a problem what exactly that particular sketch was, because it was in another exhibition. But even so, it's disappeared completely. What we do have, however, is the work on the left. It's the only oil sketch that relates to the picture that can be traced, and it's not one of the ones mentioned in the extract from Godet that we just saw. The drawings, incidentally, are not easy to trace. There's only one mentioned by Godet, but in fact, there are quite a number, and I shall be relying on them for further proceeding in the understanding of how this composition was brought to fulfillment. This one painted study for the reeds, which does exist, which you see on the left, so it doesn't fit the dimensions of any given in the Godet account. But it's interesting to note that a popular biographical study of Delaroche, published in London in 1880, reports that his infant Moses, as they call it at that stage, was, I quote, a great advance upon his earlier paintings, both in the colouring, which is clear and limpid, and in the beautiful and lifelike expression of the infant's face. Well, we don't have the infant's face here. We have some indication, probably, of the colouring. Although I must admit that I think this comment is a little mysterious, since I can't find any trace of the painting, let's say the original painting, and not this particular fragment, being shown after Delaroche's posthumous show in Paris in 1857. At any rate, we can take this at least as one, and perhaps the only, indication of the colouring of the painting which we'll be seeing forthwith in terms of the drawing and the photograph. It is, of course, inaccurate to describe this particular study as simply a study of reeds, since the figure in the corner, you can see that, of course, the original painting on the right, figures in the corner there, indicates that it was a detached section of a whole composition. Possibly it appeared, it was part of the new canvas started in 1848 and later abandoned. And this is an issue which I'll consider further as I proceed. For the moment, I think it's worth underlining here that Delaroche appears to have chosen to represent just very common or garden reeds, most literally the kind of reeds you can find in your garden or very close to it, as in that particular case for me, can be found anywhere in Northern Europe rather than any exotic variety. Half a century later, very different kind of painter, Alma Tadema, would endow the subject of the finding of Moses with a bravura demonstration of local colour, which even the reeds seem to be putting on a show to match the garish display of the entourage of Pharaoh's daughter. But this isn't Delaroche's way. His method of working out the composition over a longer period is in fact highly distinctive and, as I said before, and I hope to prove, can be understood only through the close scrutiny of his drawings, or at least a selection of the ones that are available. The part played by Delaroche's drawings in initiating as well as developing his major projects has come into focus over the past 2 decades. Stephen Duffy, who was curator of 19th century art at the Wallace Collection, had charge of the best collection of Delaroche's works outside France, always insisted on the point that the Virgin and Child, which we saw up in the Wallace Collection image there, which we'll see again, was not commissioned by, but painted for Lord Hertford. This important distinction coheres with the insight offered by an interesting letter in the Getty collection by an acquaintance of Delaroche called Hippolyte Sebran, and written to an Italian collector around 1840. Now, this collector, who doesn't give his name, or at least that's to say Sebran's letter doesn't mention the name, evidently was consulting Sebran about how he might commission a small-scale work relating to the history of Milan. Sebran advised him that he could only expect, I quote, a subject that he, Delaroche, will have chosen, since in England and in Prussia they take what he does and for the price he asks. Now, this was not an exaggeration. In effect, Delaroche's chosen method of painting these large-scale productions, and here it is literally true, as I'll be set in a moment, Prussians and also English patrons, was to invite them to his studio and to allow them to see a range of drawings on different, large number of subjects, and to choose one which he would work up into a larger painting. I am showing you that particular image because right in the center of it, there, I think, yeah, I have a lateral view there, sorry, there is, I get a rather bleak view of this. so yes, it's still there, is the house that Delaroche had bought for himself in the Rue de la Tour des Dames in the Nouvelle Eterne in the 1830s, and where he has his studio and where he made these rendezvous with the, the rich and the eager potential patrons. It's very clearly demonstrated in the case of the Prussian ambassador to Portugal, the Count Raczynski, one of the greatest collectors of the age, who chose a Roman scene from many little drawings that Delaroche had done in Rome, and then having settled on a price, it took many, many years for him to actually get the thing delivered, and when he finally got it, he said, well, I don't like it as much as your other work, but okay, it will do. Anyhow, that was the bargain set with Delaroche. It was also certainly the case with Lord Francis Egerton, the brother of the Duke of Sutherland, and who had inherited a large part of the Bridgewater collection, the Titians, Poussins, and so on, but wanted to buy a painting from Delaroche, and his brother, the Duke, reports how Francis had gone to see Delaroche in his studio, and I have the hypothesis that the drawing which he saw is the one that you see on the right there. Charles I being mocked by the soldiers of Cromwell, and the final delivery took place in 1837 of this particular picture, which was badly damaged in the Second World War, but which we revived temporarily for the exhibition of Delaroche around the Jane Grey in London, the National Gallery, in 2012. So if one imagines that situation where a collector is brought in and shown a range of drawings, and in a way, let's say the collector doesn't have the whip hand there. I mean, he does obviously for a portrait has to be a portrait, but in the case of Raczynski and Egerton, clearly it was choosing from something that Delaroche was already working on, and was therefore giving a pivotal role to the drawing in accelerating that particular choice. Well, let's assume that something of that sort took place with Baron James, the Baron de Rothschild. Now, Delaroche's drawings relating to his Moses, as we shall see, do cover a long period of time. And a large number of them were presented to the Louvre by his son Horace, who took the precaution of painting them on sheets of related material, but didn't really attempt, as far as we can see, to establish any significant chronological sequence. So here we have on the right 4 drawings which occupy the same sheet, and clearly in the Cabinet des Dessins at the Louvre, they keep them on that sheet. But there can be no doubt at all that it's just the smallest of them all, this tiny drawing, which I've blown up here to enormously greater than its original size, is the one that stands out. And here, very possibly for the first time, as what the French call a première pensée, one has the scenario that will be eventually in the finished painting. Here we have the sister of Moses peering through the reeds, and both brother and sister, both Moses and his sister, perhaps significantly looking towards us rather than at each other or at anybody else. The 2 larger and equally striking drawings, which you can here look at more exactly, also provide a very interesting insight into the development of the final work, towards the final work, although in this case they bear no direct relationship to the final theme. In the left-hand study, you see it's the mother who is carrying the child Moses to the river, while her husband stands concernedly by her side. In the right-hand study, it's the husband who carries the child, with a look of grim determination while the mother hangs back. Clearly, in these 2 studies, Delaroche is thinking above all of the intimate human relationships involved in that act of desperation, which is the mother's decision to abandon her son. But in this case, son is not present. It's the relationship between the parents that he is experimenting with, he's testing as the potential of his picture. Another drawing, however, to which Horace Delaroche awards the privilege of placing it on a single sheet, just one drawing, draws these different components into a unitary scene which integrates those diverse emotional options represented by the members of Moses' family. Here we have, as you see, a landscape rather than a portrait format. From a higher point of view, we see the river, the immobile figure of the sister, we assume the sister, by the waterside. But what also comes into the account when we look at it here is the fact that Delaroche has a very famous compositional precedent in mind. In the 1830s, Delaroche had been reproached by critics, in particular Gustave Planche, for being a plagiarist in borrowing compositional formulae from the English history painters. And he'd also, in the case of the Charles Mocht, which we saw momentarily, looked very carefully at the composition of 17th century Dutch genre scenes. In fact, I think I can show that he looked at one particular collection, the Valdo collection, which is now in the Museum at Montpellier. In this case, however, Delaroche has gone back to a source which could hardly be more canonical in the tradition of French academic painting. He has, I submit, looked very hard at Poussin. Nicolas Poussin made several versions of the subject of the finding of Moses. That's, of course, that takes place long after the exposition, but only two of the theme of that we can see here of Moses exposed on the River Nile. And one of them, which you see here, is in the Ashmolean at Oxford. The other is in Dresden. Here, as you can see, the drama of the event is concentrated with maximum effect in the spatial relationship as well as the emotional relationship between the mother, who can hardly bring herself to abandon the child, and the father who has steeled himself and moves away firmly from the desperate action. Well, I'm saying that Delaroche has looked at Poussin. Actually, he's quite unlikely to have seen the Oxford painting, since this had been in the Orléans collection and therefore had been in England since 1798, been sold in England. It was only, again, came to the public view when it was at auction in 1848, as far as I know. But it's very probable that Delaroche did know, in fact, it's certain that he would have known, the work through Claudine Bouzonnet-Stella's contemporary engraving. And you'll see an interesting point here that the engraving, as engravings do, reverses the composition as a consequence of the engraving process. And it's notable that in all the drawings that we're going to see, the parents of Moses are also moving in a left-right rather than a right-left direction. In the Poussin, it's the opposite. When we look again at Delaroche's drawing in relation to that print, the connection, I think, is quite an obvious one. Oh, is that? Yeah, that's right, yeah. But the diminishment of the human drama in the new version is also, I think, quite evident. As the two parents are now well away from the riverside, there they are up there, the tension so vividly evoked by Poussin is no longer there. There is no longer that spatial separation between the mother and the father. And this statuesque figure of the daughter really doesn't appear to express any emotion. Yet, I don't know whether you spotted it, it is just possible to identify to the right hardly more than a scribble, but it must show the origin of the motif of the sister of Moses peering through the rushes. In that way, this whole sheet can be seen as a kind of alternative solution to the previous sheet with its 4 separate drawings. It's as if Delaroche was making a critique of his Poussinist composition in which he tried out 2 possible approaches. Shall I make the different emotional states of the parents the main subject by bringing them close to the viewer? Or shall I bring the sister, who's eclipsed by the parents in Poussin's version, into prominence? And in the final painting, of course, as we know already from the photograph and the print, it is the sister peering through the rushes who shares our attention with the child Moses, and the departing parents are reduced to a mere kind of grace note in the top right-hand corner. And in the final work, another decision has been made. The painting delivered to the Rothschild places the sister in the center of the stage. And here we can recall the verse from Exodus which accompanies the publication of the photograph in the 1858 publication. I'll give the French to show how we get much closer to the meaning of the picture if we actually translate that literally. La sœur de l'enfant se tenant au loin et considérant ce qui allait arriver. That last part, to know not what would become of him, but in a more open-ended way, considering what was going to happen. What I've been doing up to this point is using Delaroche's drawings in order to suggest a progressive working out of the composition originally derived from Poussin, which ends with a landscape format being converted into portrait, horizontal emphasis into vertical, and the foregrounding of the sister combined with the backgrounding, if you can use that word, of the parents of Moses. But what I'm going to suggest now is there's also a kind of binary logic governing this development. Delaroche tended throughout his career to work through the juxtaposition and sequence of related scenes. And even if this process is not always evident from the final paintings, it's certainly perceptible when we follow the drawings. Just show you there as it were, last glimpse for a moment of the little drawing on the right, and you can see the parents as they are in the original painting, as photographed in the top right-hand corner. Now there's another drawing relating to the Moses painting, which has only come to light recently. And this is part not of the Louvre collection, but of the collection of additional drawings put up for sale after the death of the last of the Delaroche-Vernet family, Madame Aurole. The most finished of the sketches on this particular sheet, as you see there on the left, frames a composition in which the child is in the foreground, there, and the parents are ascending a flight of stone steps to what may possibly be a kind of temple, at least a stone building. Faint marks in the lower part of the sheet, down here, indicate Egyptian buildings, a bit of Egyptian writing, in other words, a kind of Egyptian decor, possible decor for the painting. But the emphasis in the little drawing is, once again, on the relationship of the parents, and the child has been put in two. The mother, we can see what she's turning towards is for one last look at her child, and the father is guiding her away. This remains, as it were, the invariant all the way through, right from these early drawings, which I suppose to be from the early 1840s, although, as I said before, the motif of the parents turns out in the end to be a kind of minor element in the drama we are confronted with. You can see here a slightly sketchier drawing on the right, which is also about how he configures the relationship between the parents. But if we move to consider the images to the top right-hand side of that sheet, something very different is going on. Something, it appears, is totally different. There's a Madonna with her child, seemingly enthroned. A more sketchy scene to the right, and above it, a landscape format scene centered around a Madonna and Child. When this drawing was originally advertised in the sale catalogue of the private gallery that had it on sale, it was suggested that the latter, at the top, was quite simply a scene of the Magi adoring the Christ child. But I think we can see that that's clearly not the case. And one very important point, a tiny, tiny, tiny pyramid to the left, juxtaposed with a palm tree, gives the game away. The scene is, in fact, an episode from the flight into Egypt. For episodes from the flight to be customarily stocked with a large company of angels, I think is very clear from the contemporary print, almost exactly contemporary, that you see here on the left appearing in a commonly read French magazine. Let's look again at the Madonna enthroned here. On closer inspection, it turns out that the throne that she's enthroned on is ruined. And this is presumably because of the fitting with the iconography traditional since the Middle Ages of the fall of the idols, which takes place as the Madonna and Child enter Egypt in one of the apocryphal Gospels, and a tradition which has been traced very brilliantly by Michael Camille in a famous book. And in the faint but still just perceptible little sketch to her right, let me get that. Yes, you see there, it's hardly perceptible, but I think there's enough for one to see the origin of the flight into Egypt. Gospel of St. Matthew, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt." In other words, all of these sketches, which I've isolated from the sheet, belong together, and what is common to them is the Egyptian connection. The exposition of Moses from the Old Testament is at the bottom and right left-hand corner of the sheet, and the flight to Egypt from the New Testament on the top right. That Delaroche's attention was turning to Egyptian matters in the early 1840s is, in all events, understandable. His father-in-law, Horace Vernet, had made a successful and very wide-ranging visit to the Eastern Mediterranean in 1838. He'd brought back numerous daguerreotypes, which Delaroche himself had the duty of sorting out for admission to the library of the Institut. And in addition to that, Horace Vernet's own publications, such as this Life of Napoleon, published in Britain in 1840, set the campaigns of the emperor against this picturesque background. Always the pyramids appearing, not only because there was a battle of the pyramids that Napoleon fought, but also because they, as it were, became the signature of the Egyptian scene in general. Vernet himself, of course, had also, as a result of his journey to the Eastern Mediterranean, he had struck an oriental note of local color in such paintings as this one, with an Old Testament theme, Judah and Tamar, from 1840. But I will be suggesting that Delaroche's compositional logic was working in a totally different way. The presence of drawings relating to the flight into Egypt on the same sheet as those illustrating the exposition of Moses points, I think, to what I called the binary logic of his composition, not only observable in this case, but in many of the significant phases of his career. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to recapitulate and look more broadly at some of the material which shows this principle to be at work, even though, again, it can only be fully detected through examination of his extensive production of drawings together with his paintings. Well, the binary principle is well known as a feature of the decorative arts in general in respect of what we call pendants. I think you'll probably be amused here to see two vases which trade on Delaroche's celebrity in the early 1830s by juxtaposing two of the paintings, or images of two of the paintings he exhibited to great acclaim at the 1831 Paris Salon. And apart from the fact that both were painted within a span of around 2 years and both were sold at the same salon, there's absolutely nothing in particular to link the two works. But a more significant case is presented by two paintings, the paintings bearing the titles Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin. Cardinal Richelieu, going to his death, and on the right, Cardinal Mazarin. Also shown in the 1831 Salon, and actually bought by the same patron, the Comte de Portales. They bear different dates, 1829 and 1830 respectively, but both can be said to illustrate Delaroche's continuing interest in the theme of royal authority being usurped by the influence of all-powerful 17th century ministers of the crown, these two cardinals. And Delaroche wasn't the only person to be interested in that. The novel by Alfred de Vigny, Cinq Mars, had brought out the Richelieu side of that equation. Well, Delaroche could have sold them separately, but Portales decided to keep them together, and the Wallace collection, which acquired them at the Portales sale, continues to show them as balancing them one another, as you see, although one has to admit that the insertion between the two of Léon Coignier's lively scene from Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe is not perhaps the happiest of interpolations. I want to interpolate at this particular point myself a point of specifically local interest, in that the Fogg Museum actually possesses an interesting study for the Mazarin. See the Mazarin at the top, on the right, the study. It's been provisionally titled Two Ladies in Theatrical Costume, but as you see, I think there's really no doubt about this. There they are, the two ladies, two other ladies, the same ladies. And they represent the two figures of Marie Mancini and Mademoiselle de Montpensier, the grande glamoiselle, who are standing to the right-hand side of a scene involving the Cardinal Mazarin on his deathbed. Incidentally, you might say, well, this chair is not carried over into the final composition, but it actually, you find the chair in a very fine sketch for the Mazarin in the museum at Nantes. When I was first working on my monograph on Delaroche, which Eva Lauer-Burkhardt mentioned just a moment ago, in the mid-1990s, one of the very few people in France who had any interest in the work of Delaroche was a student at the École du Louvre called Nicolas Milovanovic, who was compiling a dissertation on these two paintings and slipped me the information. I'm happy to say that today he's risen to quite a high rank in the hierarchy of the Louvre. So Richelieu and Mazarin were perhaps not intended as pendants, but they were closely linked thematically. And one of the very interesting points that emerges from a study of Delaroche's drawings with the paintings is the fact that a drawing sometimes reflects a scene which is anticipating a future painting, even though it's never developed in itself, finally, in the form of a painting. The drawing that you see on the left there, in a private German collection, puzzled me greatly, and it also puzzled the owner. It seemed to represent a highly charged action of a theatrical nature. And I came to the conclusion, finally, that the action in question could only be the last act of Alexandre Dumas' notorious play, Henri III et sa cour, premiered in Paris in 1829, one of the great events of the early Romantic theatre, and which, in view of his very frequent contacts with the stage, the audience very probably included Delaroche, but even if it didn't, he obviously knew about it and he could have read the stage play. What you see here is Dumas projecting the violent entry of the Duc de Guise into the bedroom of his wife, who he suspects of dalliance with the king's favourite, Saint-Mégrin. if one goes a little into the content of this final act, what happens is that the Duc de Guise enters his mother's, his wife's bedroom rapidly, and the favourite, whether guilty or not, has actually jumped out of the window. And there's a chap saying, oh, he's jumped out of the window, but we've got him. We've got people stationed in the road below who cut him to pieces. Now, in 1835, probably at least 5 years since that drawing, Delaroche reached perhaps the final high point of his early career when he painted for the heir to the French throne, the Duc d'Orléans, the work representing the assassination of the Duc de Guise. Duc de Guise, down there. There can surely be very little doubt of the visual as well as the thematic connection between the drawing and the assassination of pictures, despite that lapse of time between the early drawing and the final painting. For one thing, I think it's very significant that the open window, which plays an important part, I won't say in the drawing, but certainly in the scene that the drawing represents, is echoed by the significant contrivance of the door to the left of the painting, from which a very timorous Henri III trips to witness the demise of his overmighty subject. It's interesting to note that detached from the context of the early drawing, and indeed from the play by Dumas, the assassination, when seen on its own, had surely lost that moral dimension of how violence begets violence, which must have remained, at any rate, in Delaroche's mind. Actually, the Orléans family were closely linked with the Guises. In fact, they were the heirs to the last of the Guises, so they could only treat the Duc de Guise as a martyr, rather than being somebody who, in terms of this comparison, has received his just deserts. Well, my point is that there's often an explicit or implicit pairing, which becomes clear when we look at Delaroche's way of working. This is very often linked to that kind of moral consideration, and it's surely borne out by one of his largest and most extraordinary drawings, again from the period around 1830. The fact that this is one of the most extensive sets of designs for the painting of Jane Grey, which you saw right at the beginning, begun probably earlier than 1833, but finished then and exhibited in 1834. That might be an argument for a later dating of this sheet of drawings, but this would ignore what I think is a significant fact, that the more finished sketch here on the above the Jane Grey sketch for the child notionally known as Louis XVII, he didn't ever actually ascend to the throne, but he was the son of the king who was guillotined, and his sister, who was also imprisoned in the Temple period during the Revolution. The little title up above refers to the latter, the sister, as La Dauphine. This title was strictly reserved for the wife of the heir to the French throne, so it could only have been applied to the daughter of the executed Louis XVI during that period of the 1820s when she was in fact the prospective queen, being married to the heir of Charles X, who was on the throne from 1824 to 1830. I think it's interesting because Balzac, when he refers to her as La Dauphine in one of his novels, it's always when he's situated that particular time of the novel in the Restoration period, the late Restoration period. So I'm suggesting that once again, and over a period of several years, Delaroche was associating two historical examples, in this case involving blameless young people who are being executed, or at least who are dying, the young Louis XVII in the Temple, and Lady Jane, barely a girl when she's executed, having been propelled to the throne by her over-ambitious relatives. Through listing these various examples of pairing of motifs in Delaroche's work, I'm hoping I can set the scene for a pairing which has not ever been made before. all of these have in a certain sense, and yet seems to shed a new light on the significance of the Moses which was bought by the Rothschilds in 1853, the one which has vanished from view but leaving behind some of these clues to its genesis that I've been showing you. The last drawing that I was discussing, which involved a new variation on the motif of the departing parents, also displayed, according to my argument, if you remember, a group of subsidiary sketches which were all related to the theme of the flight into Egypt. Now, the painting bought by Lord Hertford in 1844 has traditionally, when in the Wallace collection, been identified by the rather anodyne title of Virgin and Child. But at the retrospective exhibition of Delaroche's works in 1857, when it was sent over to be shown in Paris, it was entitled Marie dans le désert, Mary in the Desert. And it should be regarded, in fact, as a version, a very idiosyncratic version, but a version no less, of the traditional theme of the rest on the flight to Egypt. And Delaroche signed and dated the work, 1844 Rome, testifying to the fact that he'd spent the period from spring to autumn of that year in Rome. Now here you see on the left a landscape drawing of the town of Aricia, southeast of Rome in the Alban Hills. And I think one can see how he has really transposed the features of that particular rocky background sketched on a visit to Aricia into the scenery which stretches out behind the Madonna. And the drawing also indicates, it's almost too tiny for you to see, but it's definitely there, tiny figures along this roadway. Absolutely tiny figures, hardly more than a little speck of graphite. And in one case, I assure you, a person who pauses beside a wayside cross. And this feature, the tiny figures in the background, who are nonetheless as significant, has been carried over into the painting, as we see there, the tiny figure who we expect, I suppose, to be the figure of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who is keeping watch in the background. Now, this drawing of Aricia can, I think, be compared closely with another of the drawings in the Louvre, which you see there at the top on the right, where the main subject is again a rocky landscape with small figures, but with the addition, in this case, of, on the right, we've almost seen that before once or several times, the version of the parents of Moses themselves climbing the hill. You'll also notice, I think there, which will, I think, have occasion to note this again, a tower at the top of the hill which is being climbed. The key drawing for me, I should say, in all of this sequence is therefore the one which clearly showed both the expedition of Moses and the flight into Egypt on one sheets. And both of these projects would ultimately result in the choice of a portrait rather than a landscape format, in which one figure, the sister of Moses and the Madonna, comes to the fore, see this here, while the others, the parents of Moses and Joseph, both hardly need to show you, but just to say are the parents of Moses, and there is Joseph, are receding into the background. And as I think I noticed earlier, but just to remind you, it's not inappropriate to show them on the same screen next to one another, because both of the two works are identical in height, although the Moses is very slightly wider. Well, can we go further than these formal similarities in suggesting a kind of complementary relationship between these two works? I think we can. Delaroche has surely developed both themes in parallel in order to draw upon the traditional typology whereby Old Testament anticipates New as, if one goes back a very long way in the program of the medieval stained glass in the choir of Canterbury Cathedral, devised, I think, originally by St. Anselm. The message of the Bible is that, quoting that again, the sister of the child Moses kept back and considered what was to happen. In the text of Exodus, this means on the literal level, the sister is anxious about the fate of her little brother, who will become the prophet Moses. But here, Delaroche has advanced the sister from the background, where Poussin kept her, and put her in the foreground, or more exactly, showed her feeling her way through the rushes, as though she were thinking her way into the future. And notice she's not looking at Moses, but she's looking out in another direction. She's not consumed with grief like the parents. And again, another striking thing, the child Moses is not looking back to his mother, as in Poussin, or indeed at his sister, but outwards, interpellating the viewer. It's strange indeed, we could say almost, that the painting of 1853 finds its future in the painting of 1844. No longer the pairing of Old Testament sister and child, but the pairing of New Testament mother and child. The child now asleep in his mother's arms, and it is her eyes that now anxiously interrogate the future. And it's also, of course, impossible to miss the physical similarity between the infant Moses and the Christ child, although these two paintings have been brought to completion over a period of perhaps 10 years. Delaroche had, incidentally, throughout his career, taken special care in the representation of children and indeed babies. And these not infrequently provide a kind of emotional focus for the composition. I'm just taking two examples, more or less at random, but one of them here is the child who is actually being dropped from the arms of his assassinated father in the death of President Duranty, painted in 1827. But of course, it's revived as a study lithograph in 1846 there. And the haunting figure of the boy who alone turns around and confronts the viewer out of the motley crew of citizens who are returning to the Hôtel de Ville after sacking the Bastille is the one that you see on the right. I should note that this relatively unknown painting of 1839 is now splendidly installed at the Petit Palais, thanks to the very enterprising curator of that museum, Christophe Leribaud. I want to conclude this lecture by quoting from a posthumous portrait of Delaroche by his friend Robert Fleury, who also painted a portrait. His naturally morose spirit was as concerned for the future as for the present. He understood that the future of a painter does not reach the masses except through diffusion through engraving. He felt that engraving was the sole means of guaranteeing his fame against the disappearance of his works, their annihilation by fire, or simply their acquisition by art lovers whose galleries are necessarily barred to the public. He often used to reiterate on the subject that he wished, through engraving, to raise a monument to his memory in his lifetime. Robert Fleury is deliberately placed in this portrait behind the anxious figure of Delaroche, a famous engraving by the Baron Boucher Desnoyers after Raphael's Transfiguration. You can see it just behind his head, which seems to symbolize there both the transforming miracle of great art, but also the transformative power of reproductive engraving. Yet what I've hoped to have shown in this lecture is the point that Delaroche's legacy is not only to be found in the record of the engravings such as the Anglicare Dupont, which you see there on the left. Though they have indeed partly compensated in a small way, for the disappearance of paintings like his Moses. It can also be retraced through the labyrinthine testimony of his surviving drawings. Thank you.
As an archaeologist, felt as you were speaking that you served as an archaeologist in piecing all of this mosaic together toward something that needed reconstruction, but we didn't have the whole of it. But I came to the lecture this evening not only because it's in honor of Henri and he was a colleague and is a close friend, but also because I was curious about whether Delaroche himself would have been influenced by Napoleon's expeditions to Egypt and the fact that at exactly the same time Layard and others and French were excavating in the ancient Near East, and it was really the generation of exploration of the 1850s, contemporary with some of Delaroche's work. But I don't see much in the Delaroche that you showed us of that archaeological, scientific bent of others as archaeologists in the exact same period. So I wonder if you could explain that a little bit. It seems as if his excavations were all inside himself and inside the Old Testament and New Testament traditions rather than in the so-called scientific expeditions that were going out contemporary with his work.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I can quite see that there would have been an expectation that he would have made more use of the material which he certainly knew. And of course, as a member of the Institute, which he would have been familiar with. I think the drawing that I showed, which indicates him sketching Egyptian ruins and a little bit of Egyptian writing, as it were, this represents a moment early on when he is thinking, perhaps I should introduce a material which we know about now, which Poussin didn't know about. Effectively, of course, Poussin has river gods and so on, but you know, Poussin has, of course, absolutely no knowledge of or interest in the Nile as such. I even wondered whether the reeds that he was going to use, whether he had done a study of the kind of reeds that you find along the Nile, which clearly Al-Muqaddimah had done. And at each point, it seemed to me that it was a definite decision not to do that, not to introduce signs of what would become, with Al-Muqaddimah certainly, and possibly before that, an integral part of historical reconstitution. And I think it's not because he, let's say, I'm sure that as in most things, and particularly in the context of being a member of the Institute. I mean, like, for example, to take the phenomenon of his interest in photography, he is the person who writes the defense of photography for Arago, which Arago uses. As far as I know, he never had a single photograph taken of him, or was indeed, I mean, I probably would have come across it, I've certainly never seen one. And yet at the same time, a whole generation of French photographers, like, for example, Le Gray and Nègre, were originally in his studio. So what I would suggest really, that there's a kind of paradox there, but it's perhaps not a paradox if one recognizes that he had this really unique opportunity, which I think it must have been in some ways a responsibility, basically to paint what he liked without any notion that a patron would determine that, or that it would be determined by factors that he saw, as it were, as extrinsic to his own, I don't know, his inner life. He was somebody who, for example, he didn't say much about his inner life, but I happen to have a very beautiful image of his wife, who dies very young. A print is made of it, and he sends it to a young friend, and the young friend writes at the top of it, Delaroche has just written to a friend, quoting from Thomas Kempis's Imitation of Christ. So that I think, on a certain level, he's a very deeply spiritual person, but in this particular case, everything comes into what one reads into the figure of Moses and its relationship to a future, which is, of course, a future of the birth of Christ. So that's my answer.
I guess maybe two parts. The first part would be in looking at the painting for which you have engravings and drawings. Are there aspects of the painting that aren't predicted by the corpus of materials that you have? And secondly, was part of your methodology also looking at Delaroche paintings for which you have the paintings as well as a fuller corpus of working materials?
Well, I mean, I think the second point certainly, because for example, in the case of the Charles I mocked and so on, where I think I can spot nearly all the key references in Dutch painting, but also the references in the drawings. But the other point, we just have that image of the reeds, but I think that. Although it strikes the English writer as being, let's say, important in showing Delaroche using colour in a new way, I begin to think more and more that what Delaroche is really interested in, and because of the factor which is noted in the passage I quoted at the end, is really reproducibility. He's not interested in a painting being this particular painting. He's interested in what can be conveyed through a print after the painting. As I said, effectively, quite a lot of his paintings were destroyed or disappeared from view. Most of his most important paintings were in private collections, were not often seen by the public at this stage. So in many ways, he becomes somebody who is actually designing paintings in order that they will be not posing problems in their reproducibility. I don't think there were many painters who were thinking about things in that particular way at that particular time. But I think that the fact that he becomes the first painter to have really a large part of his work actually commemorated in a photographic album is no accident. They were eminently photographable.
Thank you for this suspenseful reconstruction of this work, of the origin of this work, and also a connection to another work. My question regards what comes through this reconstruction is this rather curious refocusing on Moses' sister, which is iconographically very rare. But what is even more puzzling is the sexualization of this figure. And I was wondering how you would explain it. I mean, she has this exposed breast. She looks really troubled in the way that, if one didn't know this story, one would think that she has just dropped this child that she has had herself into this river. So I'm wondering, how does it connect, to that kind of reading, proleptic reading of it as, her being a kind of prefiguration of Virgin Mary. How does that fit in this? And how does it fit also with your, with the concern that you attribute to Delaroche, I think very justly, concerned with reproducibility? How does that element make
the reproducibility element
of the image, how does it contribute to its life as a print? Let's put it like this, because reproducibility kind of situates it on a level of the medium, whereas what I'm talking about is really more the content.
Yes, I think, as you say, I think it's probably almost unique for the sister of Moses to be seen as a prototype of the Virgin Mary. And yet, if you think of it, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because clearly she has a kind of innocence which the mother can't have. And also, I mean, I think, is it clear in the Bible that Miriam the prophetess is also a sister of Moses? Well, it's not clear whether the sister, as described, is Miriam, but in other words, she has prophetic insights, and this would qualify her to sort of take centre stage. I should say, in relation to the archaeological point, that I'm sure that the tiny little brooch, pendant or whatever she's wearing, I'm sure that's an original Egyptian artifact, because I mean, as always in Delaroche's work, you have the choice of tiny things, a snuff box which belonged to the Emperor Napoleon in his picture of Napoleon, for example. These tiny little points, which are not local colour in a kind of general sense of mapping out a landscape or anything, but just small touches in that way. I mean, it'd be interesting, I think, if I could go back to the Poussin. Just it's not very long. Just go. You see, it's very interesting, isn't it, how the role that Poussin gives, and we feel that she's at the centre of the composition, and there she is. She's actually pointing to the city with her arm. I mean, are there any Poussin scholars here? But I don't know quite what is said about her usually. But in many ways, it's quite unclear as to what we are supposed to think about her attitude to the exposition of Moses. I'm sure Poussin had a very specific idea in mind, but I can't interpret it.
I was intrigued and would like to go back to the fragment that you showed, which I thought was very interesting.
Sorry, which
the fragment,
yes, I'll go back to that.
Yeah, there we are. Because that, how do you think it might be cut from one of the earlier canvases? Because what is intriguing is that the hand of the sister is on that side of the people moving away, while in the final composition.
In the final composition, they're moving away top right. They're top left.
Yeah.
Yes, and he may well have found that to be unsatisfactory.
Either that means a totally different composition.
Yes.
I was wondering how you.
Well, what is interesting is that the actual the entry in the Godet catalogue refers to two parts of what was originally one canvas, which are on the collection of Goupil. But they're actually, it's as if it has been cut down the middle, and therefore they are sort of wider than they are tall, whereas this is a kind of corner fragment. So it doesn't relate to the ones that are stated in Godet. That's one thing. But I'm virtually certain, as you suggest, that this isn't, as it were, a study done on its own. It's actually something which is out of an abandoned canvas at some point.
How big is it?
Oh, well, I think, do I say that? 57 by 40. 57 by 40. So it's quite large, yeah. I mean, it would have been consistent with a painting roughly of the size of the ones we've been looking at.
Right? It would be consistent with a complete...
Yes, absolutely. But it's a section which is not the section that is described as being in the collection of Goupil, which, what is described in the Goupil collection...
a private hand somewhere or other.
Yeah. Very possibly, yes. Because but it's interesting how that I mean, the motif of the departing parents and the way the mother is sort of wanting to turn around, so on, that from quite an early stage in the drawing, that's absolutely consistent, even though they are in center stage, as it were, rather than having migrated up to the top. But that also happens in the painting in the Louvre of the young Christian martyr. Uh-huh. There are people on the bank, very far away, and I think that's why I brought in this, I think, very fascinating drawing in which the people on the road in the Campagna are so tiny, but the fact that they're there is very important. There's a kind of, it's, I suppose, what in rhetorical terms we call litotes. It's an understatement, understated figures, but all the more important because they're understated.
I was wondering if you had any sense of how the particular depiction of Moses appealed to the Baron and his wife Jenny, or if you think they had any hand in how the painting turned out.
I didn't get the last bit of that. What do you think?
Also, if they had any hand in how the composition turned out.
Oh, you mean the Baron Rothschild and his wife. I mean, I thought it was a very nice detail that it hung in her bedroom, incidentally. Very, very interesting, that. Because, I mean, and when you think of it, it is a private sort of picture. And I suppose it's also, the fact it's an Old Testament subject, and the Rothschilds would have chosen that. But the answer really, I suppose, I mean, how do you, or would you have an answer to that? It's quite difficult to answer.
You know, I don't really have an answer. One of my thoughts was, you know, he married within his family. He marries his niece, and the fact that the sister is brought to the fore. I don't know if there's some sort of commentary on familiar relations there, but I really I don't know if you come across.
I mean, usually what happens in relationship, you know, the client. Artist relationship with Delaroche, as I was saying a bit before, he had this almost unique position of being able to give the client not what the client wanted, but what he wanted. And it's very funny with Count Raczynski. He has to wait for 10 years, and he's really, you know, he's paid the money up front and so on. And then finally, Delaroche changes the composition very dramatically at the end and puts it, sort of make it off-center instead of a sort of pyramidal composition. And Raczynski writes very frankly, you know, says, you know, I don't like it as much as your other work, but okay. But then he takes it with him to Portugal. As he's a Prussian ambassador to Portugal, of all things, although he's a Pole. And the King of Portugal, who was an amateur etcher, does an etching after it. and it's a wonderful example of how really it's possible to imagine now, but Delaroche's prestige is so high at that particular point that anything that he does is kind of seized with open arms by the monarchical elite, and indeed the intellectual elite, people like the von Humboldts in Berlin and so on, constantly writing to and communicating with him. I mean, it's also, it interests me too, because at this point, I mean, French aesthetics, the major writer of French aesthetics at this stage is Victor Cousin. And Victor Cousin talks about what he calls moral beauty. And he describes that, which is different from, you know, other kinds of beauty. And I think that coincides very well with what Delaroche was trying to achieve. Whether he finally achieves it is another matter. But there is a certain sense in which he's always obsessed with the idea that the French are constantly destroying each other. And in one letter he writes, you know, ever since the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, you know, this happens all the time. And during his lifetime, of course. I mean, he's born when the empire is started, and Waterloo, and then he, Revolution 1830, Revolution 1848. All of this is part of his lifetime. So that as time goes on, and with a great personal reverse of the death of his wife, he developed almost a sort of mystical interest in his paintings as becoming a kind of, I don't know, atonement for this appalling historical situation. But as I say, I mean, I'm very interested in that little letter in the for Getty, because it basically says, you don't tell Delaroche what to do, he tells you.
Do we have any evidence that there was some confusion between the client, that is James de Rothschild, and the painter, and that perhaps Rothschild was buying what he thought was a Jewish icon, not maybe aware of the antitype or type pairing, which you very, I think, rightly propose? And a second question would be, Delaroche's paintings were not only reproduced in prints and then later photographs, but as you probably know better than anybody else, as you visit museums or if you look at them sometimes on the trade, there are lots of painted, surely replicas of them, often called sketches, I think mistakenly. And looking at this remarkable picture of the hand pulling back the reeds, could that in some way be a replica? Do we have any? We don't have any technical information as to whether it was cut. It's not the.
I suppose it could. I mean, certainly, a very curious thing. I think I showed this in Leipzig, and immediately the Leipzig curator said, Arnold Böcklin, because from almost exactly the date of the final picture, but not necessarily the date of this, Böcklin does this image of a sort of, I guess, a sort of satyr-like figure finding his way through a thicket of reeds. And it seems almost inconceivable that he would not have seen some version of this, perhaps almost certainly not the version in 1853. And the question of the types and anti-types, I think he treats. He's not kind of recreating the medieval type and anti-type, but I think he thinks in those terms at the same time. And as you're right, Sam, he's sort of shifted the players in that respect. And I don't think, as far as I know, yes, I mean, is the sister of Moses the same as Miriam the prophetess, or is that still an opening? I wonder that, because it looks as though she is, and if she is, then in Exodus she will play a major part at the end, as it were. She actually salutes the successful Exodus from Egypt. So he might have made that equation as well. But certainly, I think that the similarity between the two children is very interesting, isn't it? And the fact also that Christ is asleep, whereas Moses is sort of looking into the space that we occupy. And that's a decision which he makes really quite early on. That tiny little drawing that I showed, which is about this big, already you can see that the child is actually is confronting the spectator.
So, and with that, please join me in thanking Professor Bann for an excellent.
Thank you.